Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. John Dillinger, the gangster, was gunned down in Chicago on this date 85 years ago by federal agents. He was an early victim of climate change. Let me explain why. Here's the front page of the Albuquerque Journal from July 23, 1934. Dillinger killed in Chicago. Desperado walks into gun trap of U.S. officers. Let's take a closer look at that. He is shot down in front of theater where he had been attending melodrama. Curious crowd sees the end of Notorious Badman in a blaze of gunfire. So why was he in the movie theater that day? Well, the other stories on the page give us a clue. Deaths in heatwave reached 278, unprecedented toll of life during past 7 days, all sections. Crops ruined in many parts of the country. Chicago has 101 degrees. Movie theaters were one of very few places which had air conditioning in the 1930s, so people who could afford it would go to the movie theater and stay there for as long as they could to escape the heat. My mother grew up in New York in the 1930s, and she told me that was the reason why they invented double feature matinees, because people would come in to escape the heat. The 1930s was by far the hottest decade on record in the United States. No other decade came even close. So let's see what temperatures were like in the United States on July 23, 1934, the day John Dillinger was gunned down. The purple dots show locations which were over 100 degrees on that date. As you can see, almost the entire Midwest was over 100 degrees. In fact, it was the 9th hottest day on record in the Midwest. The Midwest has only had 14 days since 1895, which averaged over 100 degrees, and they all occurred in 1901, 1934, and 1936. They've never had another day in the Midwest which averaged over 100 degrees. So I put a red star on the dot representing July 23, 1934. And it wasn't just a one-day heat wave, it was an incredible protracted heat wave. In fact, from July 19, 1934 to July 26, 1934, Mexico and Missouri was over 110 degrees every single day. Let's look at those temperatures. July 19th, 112. July 20th, 116. July 21st, 115. July 22nd, 112. July 23rd, 112. July 24th, 114. July 25th, 114. July 26th, 113. Temperatures like that in the Midwest are completely incomprehensible now. To put this in perspective, the Midwest almost never gets above 100 degrees anymore, much less 110. And here's a graph of every single 110 plus degree reading in Missouri since 1895. Missouri has had a total of 40 days since 1895 over 110 degrees, and all but one of them occurred before 1960. The last one was in 1980. And every single one of these hot days occurred with carbon dioxide levels below 350 parts per million. Climate scientists say that we need to reduce carbon dioxide levels to prevent hot days, but obviously that's not true because we had a lot more hot days when carbon dioxide levels were lower. So one of the aggravating factors of the extreme heat in 1934 was that there was a record drought across the United States. About 80% of the country was in drought. This was by far the worst drought in the history of the United States, and it occurred at very low CO2 levels. So once again, climate scientists claiming that we need to reduce CO2 levels to prevent drought is obviously total nonsense. John Dillinger, who went into the movie theater to escape the heat, wasn't the only victim of climate change in the 1930s. In fact, millions of people fled the Midwest and the Great Plains in order to escape the heat and drought of the 1930s. They moved to California and became farm workers. John Steinbeck wrote about this poignantly in The Grapes of Wrath. High school kids used to read this back in the days when children were actually taught history. But now school children are taught propaganda rather than history, so they don't hear about this. And if they are taught about the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, what they're taught is that it was farmers' fault, that the farmers caused this. The theory being that bad farming practices led to the heat and drought of the 1930s. While it's true that farming practices may have aggravated the dust, it certainly wasn't the cause of the Dust Bowl. There was a massive drought around the United States and in fact around the world in 1934. and blaming the victims is really a horrible thing to do. But fairly typical for progressives. They've been blaming the victims for as long as I can remember. Let's see what was going on in other places besides the United States in 1934. Cairns Post, February 3, 1934. World heating up. Ice dissolving at poles. Sea level will rise 40 feet. Los Angeles Times, December 30th, 1934. Whole world in freak weather year of 1934. Cold, heat, drought, and flood set new marks. Unprecedented extremes recorded in every corner of the earth. Even climate has changed in spots. Wow, so those farmers in the Oklahoma Panhandle caused worldwide freak weather. Climate alarmists obviously can't blame carbon dioxide for the freak weather of 1934, so instead they blame farmers. So let's see what scientists said in 1934. This is from that same LA Times article. How science accounts for berserk elements. Assigned reasons varied from spots of the sun to concurrences of meteorological cycles. This berserk weather, record heat, and worldwide drought is what climate alarmists now describe as the stable climate of low CO2. And they say that if we lower CO2 levels, they can bring us back to the lovely climate like we had in 1934. Now let's look at what the chief meteorologist of the U.S. Weather Bureau said about the weather in 1934. Worldwide drought is seen likely. Weatherman admits there is something wrong and that no one knows why. By Joseph Kinser, Chief Meteorologist, U.S. Weather Bureau. Washington, June 21, 1934. What is wrong with the world's weather? Is a question I've been asked many times in the past few weeks. It's much simpler to describe what is happening than try to tell why, for the truth is that no one knows why. It is quite possible that the entire world is headed for a dry period. We've known for many years that periods of high temperature and droughts go together. We do not know whether the drought causes the high temperature or the high temperature causes the drought. It's like the question, which was first, the chicken or the egg? And here's another story from Australia, June 4th, 1934. World drought. Farmers' ruinous losses. Almost universal disaster. Europe revives pagan rites. And that's what England looked like in the summer of 1934. England has just experienced the worst drought for nearly 100 years. Sydney Morning Herald, Friday, January 19, 1934. Heatwave in 3 states. Bushfires in South Australia. Party trapped by flames. Severe dry spell sweeps over country, his longest on record. Unparalleled in duration, scope, and intensity, the drought now covering 3/4 of the United States will breed upon itself until some major climatic disturbance occurs to break it up. So this horrible climate of the 1930s is what climate scientists now call the stable climate, which they want to bring us back to. You would think that climate scientists would want to try to understand and explain the extreme weather of the 1930s, but they do something completely different. They erase it. This is the NASA U.S. temperature graph from 1998, and they correctly show 1934 as being by far the hottest year on record in the United States, and 1998 being much cooler. Now let's look at the current version of the same graph. Look what they did. They cooled 1934 way down and warmed 1998 way up to make 1998 warmer than 1934. I'm going to flash back and forth between the two graphs a few times so you can see what they did. 1998 version, 2019 version, 1998 version, 2019 version. 1998 version, 2019 version. They turn cooling into warming. This is straight out of Orwell's Ministry of Truth, rewriting the past. Once again, I'll make the point that these people are not scientists. They're propagandists pretending to be scientists. Actual scientists want to understand the past, not rewrite it. In 1934, gangsters like John Dillinger were easy to identify by the way they dressed. And they still are in 2019. We just have a different type of gangsters now. They dress in white lab coats, but basically they're running the same racket. They say, "Nice little climate you got there. We wouldn't want anything bad to happen to it." Instead of extorting money with direct threats of violence like Chicago gangsters did, these people are extorting money with threats of climate violence. They're running a protection racket just like Chicago gangsters. I've talked to people in the climate science community who are perfectly aware of the fact that climate alarmism is largely nonsense. But they justify their dishonesty with excuses like, well, we need to lower CO2 levels to prevent ocean acidification anyway. Or another one is, well, we need to transition to green energy anyway to save the environment. Both excuses are complete nonsense. One of the reasons I do this is to prevent green energy from destroying our environment. These climate scientists are just rationalizing their bad behavior with even worse excuses. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science, propaganda, and organized crime for a long time.